The elevator didn't just stop, it died. 1 second, we were descending smoothly between the 34th and 35th floors. The next, a violent shudder rattled my teeth, followed by the sickening drop of gravity. Then, absolute stillness. The lights flickered and dimmed to a murky gloom. The silence was oppressive. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the sudden, terrifying intimacy of it. In the dark, the professional world dissolved. The only thing left was the scent of sandalwood and cold air, Daisy's perfume. Standing inches from me, the armor of the most terrifying woman in the building was about to crack. To understand why that scent made my pulse hammer harder than the mechanical failure, you have to understand the geography of our office. Daisy wasn't just a boss, she was an institution. As the CFO, she existed in a world of sharp lines, tailored Italian wool, and terrifying competence. She was the kind of woman who could silence a boardroom with a single arched eyebrow. I was just a junior analyst, a cog in the machine, invisible in the grand scheme of her fiscal year. For 2 years, I watched her from the safety of my cubicle, or through the glass walls of conference room B. We called it the fishbowl, but she was the shark. I'd see her pacing during high-stakes calls, her silhouette cut against the city skyline, untouchable. She moved with a predatory grace, never rushing, never stumbling. While the rest of us were drowning in spreadsheets and coffee spills, Daisy remained pristine. She was a study in control, a master of the corporate poker face. Our interactions were a masterclass in professional distance. They were the architecture of my longing. A curt email approving a variance report, signed with a single initial. A swift nod in the hallway as she passed, trailing that signature scent of sandalwood and authority. A polite good morning in the break room while waiting for the espresso machine, her eyes never leaving her phone. I remember one Tuesday when she held the door for me. Her hand brushed my sleeve, lighter than a breath, and I felt the heat of it for 3 hours. She was a fortress, and I was just looking at the walls, wondering what it would take to breach them. But the distance didn't stop the pull. It made it worse. It turned a simple office crush into a dangerous, agonizing liability. I memorized the rhythm of her days. I knew she took her coffee black at 8:15 a.m. I knew she tapped her pen against her left ring finger when she was annoyed. I knew the specific cadence of her heels on the marble floor, a sound that triggered a Pavlovian spike of adrenaline in my chest. It was pathetic, really. I was projecting depth onto a surface I couldn't scratch. I told myself it was admiration for her career, for her power. But late at night, when the office was empty and the city lights blurred outside, I knew it was something raw and terrifyingly physical. I wanted to know what happened when the control snapped. I wanted to be the reason she lost her composure. I kept it buried under layers of professional decorum. I wore my own armor, blazers from clearance racks, and a meticulously neutral expression. I became the perfect employee, reliable, quiet, observant. I thought I could survive like that forever, admiring the art from behind the velvet rope. I thought I was safe in my invisibility. I convinced myself that this proximity was enough, that breathing the same recycled air as her was the closest I would ever get to the fire without burning down my career. Then came the announcement. The merger. The merger from hell, as the senior VPs whispered in the break room. It was a hostile acquisition that required a forensic audit of 5 years of financial data. It wasn't just a project, it was a siege. We were fortifying the company against a hostile takeover, and Daisy was the general demanding absolute loyalty. It was an impossible task with an impossible deadline. The directive came down from Daisy's office on a Tuesday morning. Mandatory overtime, weekend shifts, and a dedicated task force. And because the universe has a twisted sense of humor, my name was at the top of the analyst list. Suddenly, the glass walls were gone. I was pulled into her orbit. The distance that had kept me safe evaporated, replaced by the suffocating proximity of the war room. We were going to be trapped together in the high-stakes pressure cooker of corporate finance, fighting to save the company before the quarter ended. I thought the work would kill me. I didn't realize the real danger was going to be the way she looked at me when the spreadsheets blurred and the coffee ran out. I didn't know that the architecture of distance was about to collapse, leaving us standing in the rubble, waiting for the elevator doors to close. The safety of the open floor plan was about to be traded for the intimate danger of a steel box. The week leading up to the blackout didn't feel like time passing. It felt like oxygen slowly leaving a room. The merger from hell wasn't an exaggeration. It was a war of attrition. On Monday, the conference room was full. 12 analysts, 3 VPs, and enough nervous energy to power the grid. But as the hours bled into days, the herd thinned. By Wednesday, the VPs had retreated to their corner offices or their suburban homes, leaving the grunt work to the nocturnal creatures. By Thursday, it was just a skeleton crew. And by Friday, as the city lights flickered on below us, the office was a tomb. It was just the two of us. Exhaustion acts like a solvent on professional boundaries. It strips away the polish. When you've been staring at the same spreadsheet for 16 hours, the hierarchy begins to blur. The silence of the office after midnight changes the physics of the room. The hum of the HVAC system becomes a roar. The cleaning crew's vacuum on the floor below sounds like a heartbeat. In that vacuum, the small sounds of our existence became amplified. I heard the soft sigh she let out when a formula didn't balance. I heard the sound of her removing her earrings, the tiny clink of gold hitting the mahogany desk. A sound so intimate it felt like I shouldn't have heard it. We fell into a rhythm born of survival. The shared takeout containers became a strange, silent ritual. Sitting across from her at the small round table in her office, surrounded by stacks of paper, the air smelled of Thai basil and rain. I watched her loosen her silk scarf, exposing the column of her neck, a sliver of vulnerability that made my mouth dry. She wasn't the untouchable CFO in those hours. She was just a woman rubbing her temples, trying to keep the headache at bay. I saw a smear of ink on her thumb, a flaw in the masterpiece, and I had to clasp my hands under the table to stop myself from reaching out to wipe it away. Then came the moment on Thursday night that almost broke me. It was a simple file transfer. I needed to hand her the physical copy of the risk assessment for final sign-off. I walked over to her desk, the carpet swallowing the sound of my steps. She didn't look up immediately. She was lost in the glow of her monitor, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, a look I'd never seen during the day. "Here's the variance report, Daisy," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. She turned, startled, and reached for the folder. I didn't let go fast enough. For a fraction of a second, her fingers brushed mine. It wasn't a collision. It was a graze. The friction of fingerprints against fingerprints. The shock of it was absolute. Her skin was warmer than I expected, a stark contrast to the conditioned chill of the office. The air between us didn't just thicken, it solidified. I felt a jolt of static, or maybe just pure nerve, shoot up my arm and settle heavy in my chest. I froze. She froze. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time in 2 years, the professional mask was gone. Her pupils were blown wide, dark pools reflecting the blue light of the screens. There was no "good job," no "thank you." Just a heavy, suspended silence where the question hung in the air, unasked but deafening. "Did you feel that too?" Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then snapped back up, terrified. She pulled her hand back as if the file were burning. "Thank you," she said, her voice clipped, the ice returning instantly. She turned back to her screen, her shoulders rigid. I walked back to my desk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, realizing that the danger wasn't the merger anymore. It was us. Friday night was the crescendo. We hit the deadline at 10:45 p.m. The final upload bar crawled to 100%, and the tension in the room snapped like a cut wire. The adrenaline crashed, leaving us hollowed out and trembling. The building was silent, the city below asleep. We were the last 2 souls in the skyscraper. "We're done," she said, standing up and smoothing her skirt, though her hands were shaking slightly. Let's get out of here. We packed up in sync, the movements practiced and fluid. We walked out of the suite together, the heavy glass doors locking behind us with a finality that echoed down the marble hallway. We were walking toward the elevator bank, shoulder to shoulder, the space between us charged with everything we hadn't said all week. We were tired, defenses down, walking straight into the trap. The walk to the elevator bank felt less like a commute and more like a procession. The hallway stretched out before us, a tunnel of polished marble and recessed lighting that seemed to elongate with every step. My heels struck the floor with a sharp, rhythmic clack that echoed off the walls, a stark contrast to the muffled silence of the carpeted office we'd just left. Daisy walked beside me, her stride shortened by exhaustion, but still possessing that inherent, terrifying grace. She didn't look at me. She kept her gaze fixed on the brushed steel doors at the end of the corridor, her profile etched in concentration, or perhaps just the sheer effort of keeping her composure intact. I was bone tired. My limbs felt heavy, weighted down by days of adrenaline that had suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache. Every step required a conscious signal from my brain to my legs. The air between us was devoid of the usual office chatter. There was no, "have a good weekend," no discussion of the weather. There was only the sound of our movement and the hum of the building's life support systems. I was hyper-aware of the distance between our shoulders, 6 inches of charged space that felt like a minefield. I wanted to widen the gap to breathe easier, but I also felt a magnetic pull to close it, to lean into the gravity she generated. We reached the elevator bank. I reached out to press the call button, but her hand was already there. Our fingers didn't touch this time, but the synchronization sent a shiver down my spine. The button glowed a soft, expectant white. We stood there, watching the digital numbers descend above the doors, counting down the seconds until we could escape each other. 38, 37, 36. The arrival of the car was announced by a cheerful, synthetic chime that sounded obscenely bright in the quiet hallway. The doors slid open with a smooth hiss, revealing the interior of the elevator car. It was a box of mirrors and mahogany, designed to impress clients, but right now, it looked like a cell. We stepped inside. I moved to the back corner, instinctively seeking the furthest point from the control panel where she stood. Daisy pressed the button for the lobby. The doors hesitated for a fraction of a second, then slid shut, sealing us in. The sound of the latch engaging was final, a heavy thud that cut off the safety of the open floor plan. We were alone. The descent began smoothly enough. There was that familiar, weightless sensation as the floor dropped away, the subtle pressure in the ears. I watched the numbers on the display panel flicker. 34, 33. And then, the world tilted. It wasn't a slow deceleration. It was a violent, structural rejection of movement. A horrific groan of tearing metal reverberated through the shaft, a sound so loud it vibrated in my teeth. The car jerked upward, then dropped, a sickening free-fall plunge that lasted only a second, but felt like a lifetime. My stomach slammed into my throat. I grabbed the handrail, my knuckles turning white, bracing for an impact that never came. Instead, the emergency brakes engaged with a bone-jarring slam. The car shuddered violently, swinging slightly in the shaft like a pendulum, before coming to a dead, unnatural halt. The overhead lights flickered, buzzed angrily, and then died, leaving us in a heavy brown twilight powered only by the emergency track lighting near the floor. The hum of the ventilation system whined down to a stop. Silence rushed in to fill the void. It was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. We were statues in the gloom, processing the shift from motion to stasis. Then, Daisy's training kicked in. She didn't scream, she didn't gasp. She simply straightened her blazer, though I saw her hand tremble as she reached for the emergency panel. She pressed the call button, holding it down with a thumb that looked pale in the dim light. A burst of static crackled from the speaker grill, harsh and loud. "Security," a bored voice filtered through, tinny and distorted. "Is there a problem in car 4? Daisy leaned in, her voice steady, though it lacked its usual projection. "We are stuck between floors. The car dropped and the power is out. We need immediate assistance." There was a pause, filled with the sound of shuffling papers on the other end. "Copy that, Car 4. We see the fault on the board. Looks like a main breaker trip and a mechanical seize. We have to reset the system manually from the roof, and the tech is about 40 minutes out. Then it's another 10 to cycle the brakes." 40 minutes? Daisy repeated, the first crack of incredulity slipping into her tone. "We are suspended in a shaft. It's getting warm in here. Protocol is to stay put, ma'am. Do not attempt to force the doors. We'll get you out. Sit tight. ETA is 45 minutes, minimum." The line clicked dead. The static vanished. Daisy stared at the speaker grill for a long moment, her reflection ghostly in the darkened brass panel. She slowly lowered her hand. 45 minutes. 3/4 of an hour trapped in a steel box measuring 6 feet by 6 feet. The realization settled over me like a physical weight. The air was already starting to feel still, the circulation dead. But the heat wasn't just coming from the lack of ventilation. It was radiating from the woman standing 3 feet away. The walls of the elevator felt like they were inching closer, compressing the space, forcing our orbits to collide. We weren't just stuck in an elevator. We were stuck in the inevitable. The steel cage had locked, and there was nowhere left to run. The silence that followed the security guard's voice wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that settled on my shoulders and pressed against my eardrums like deep water. The ventilation system, usually a constant, invisible hum that scrubbed the air of humanity and kept the office at a sterile 68 degrees, had sputtered and died with the power. In its absence, the atmosphere in the car began to shift immediately. It was subtle at first, a creeping stagnation, but within minutes, the climate control's residual chill evaporated. The air grew still, then warm, then thick. It felt less like oxygen and more like a fluid we were forced to move through, a viscous medium that trapped heat and held it close to our skin. Daisy moved first. The rigid posture that had defined her for the last 2 years, the spine of steel that held up the entire finance department, finally gave way. She didn't collapse, but she yielded to the gravity of the situation. She took a half step back and leaned against the brass handrail that ran along the rear wall. The metal creaked softly under her weight, a sound so sharp in the quiet that I almost flinched. She tipped her head back against the mirrored panel, the glass cool against her hair, and let out a long, shaky exhale. It was the sound of a dam breaking, just a hairline fracture, but enough to let the pressure bleed out. She closed her eyes. With her eyes closed, the power dynamic in the box fractured. Without the piercing intelligence of her gaze to pin me in place, I was free to look. Really look. And what I saw terrified me more than the suspended drop. I saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands as she clasped them in front of her waist. I saw the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat, rapid and undeniable. She wasn't the shark in the fishbowl anymore. She was a woman trapped in a box, breathing the same limited, heating air as me. The sensory deprivation of the dark only amplified the sensory overload of her presence. In the dim emergency lighting, shadows pooled in the hollows of her collarbones. The heat rising in the car began to unlock the chemistry of her perfume. The sandalwood scent, usually a crisp professional signature, turned sultry and heavy. It mixed with the smell of warm electronics and the faint metallic tang of fear. It filled my nose, my lungs, coating the back of my throat until I could taste her proximity. It was intoxicating and claustrophobic all at once, a biological signal that cut through the intellectual panic. I tried to regulate my own breathing, but the air was getting too thin, too shared. Every inhale felt like I was stealing oxygen from her. Every exhale mingled with hers in the tight space. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the rustle of her silk blouse as her chest rose and fell. I could hear the friction of wool against the brass rail. These were the sounds of intimacy, the kind of acoustic details you only get when you are wrapped in sheets with someone, not trapped in a corporate elevator. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wet thudding that I was sure she could hear. I felt exposed, stripped of my analyst's camouflage, standing raw in the rising heat. My mind raced, caught in a feedback loop of panic and desire. Part of me was calculating the oxygen exchange rate, the structural integrity of the brakes, the HR implications of sweating through my shirt in front of the CFO. But the louder part of me was screaming that this was it. This was the proximity I had fantasized about for months, warped into a nightmare scenario. The universe had granted my wish with a monkey's paw twist. I was finally alone with her, but we were helpless. The heat pricked at my skin, a layer of dampness forming at my hairline. I wanted to take off my blazer, but the action felt too intimate, too undressed. So I stood there, roasting in my professional armor, unable to tear my eyes away from the line of her jaw. Then the shift happened. It wasn't a sound or a movement. It was a change in the frequency of the room. Daisy didn't lift her head. She didn't straighten her posture. She simply opened her eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't look at the ceiling or the floor or the dead control panel. She looked straight at me. Caught. I should have looked away. The protocol, the survival instinct of the junior employee, dictated that I immediately avert my gaze, apologize, and stare at my shoes until the doors opened. But I couldn't. The heat had melted the protocol. I stayed locked on her, my breath caught in my chest, waiting for the reprimand. But it didn't come. She didn't glare. She just watched me watching her, her pupils blown wide in the dim light, reflecting the raw, unpolished reality of the moment. The silence stretched, no longer empty, but charged with a sudden electric acknowledgement. "It's the maintenance contract," she said finally. Her voice was low, cutting through the thick, stagnant air like a serrated blade. It was such a mundane observation, so aggressively corporate, that it almost made me laugh. Here we were, suspended in a void, sweating through our clothes, darkness pressing against our eyelids, and she was analyzing the vendor agreement. They switched providers in Q3 to cut costs. I told the board it was a mistake. I told them the service intervals were insufficient for a building of this age. I cleared my throat, the sound rough and scraping against the silence. "You did. I remember the memo. October 14th. You remember the date? I remember everything you write, Daisy." The words hung there. Too honest. Too raw. The subtext wasn't just heavy. It was crushing the air out of the room. It stripped away the pretense of the conversation immediately. She didn't respond to the admission. Instead, she pushed herself off the back rail. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a predator testing the water tension before a strike. She took a step toward the control panel, which brought her a step closer to me. The space in the elevator was already small. Now, with her in motion, it felt microscopic. She pretended to inspect the panel, her fingers hovering over the dead buttons. But she wasn't looking at the numbers. She was looking at the reflection of us in the darkened brass plate surrounding the controls. She was close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating from her blazer. It was a physical wall of warmth, distinct from the ambient stuffiness of the car. She didn't retreat. She lingered there, invading the invisible buffer zone that employees are supposed to maintain around executives. The scent of sandalwood was overwhelming now, stripped of its cool, air-conditioned context. It smelled like skin and expensive soap, and a sharp spike of anxiety. "I hate small spaces," she whispered. It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a confession. The armor didn't just crack. It shattered. Daisy, the woman who stared down hostile takeovers without blinking, was trembling. Her hand drifted from the panel and settled on the wall next to my head. It wasn't a trap, exactly. There was no malice in it, but it was a barrier. She had effectively boxed me into the corner. "I feel like the walls are breathing," she murmured, her voice tight, the cadence rapid. "Like they're contracting." "Look at me," I said, the command slipping out before I could check it against my survival instincts. "Don't look at the walls. Just look at me." She turned. She didn't just turn her head. She pivoted her entire body until she was facing me completely. The movement cut off my escape route. I was pressed against the mahogany paneling, the grain digging into my shoulder blades through my thin shirt. She was inches away. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the tiny imperfection in her eyebrow arch, the way her mascara was just barely smudged at the corner, evidence of a 14-hour day. The proximity was dizzying. It was the sudden collapse of 2 years of distance into a single square foot of floor space. She looked down at me. In her heels, she had 2 inches on me, and right now, that height difference felt monumental. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then snapped back up to my eyes. The fear in her face was receded, replaced by something darker, heavier. The air between us was so charged, it felt like ozone before a storm. She leaned in. The movement was slow, agonizingly telegraphed. She wasn't checking the buttons. She wasn't looking for a way out. She was looking for a way in. Her head tilted, bringing her lips close to my ear. I stopped breathing. My heart stopped beating. The universe narrowed down to the sensation of her breath ghosting against the sensitive skin of my neck. "This is our only chance," she whispered. The words vibrated in my chest, bypassing my ears and hitting the nervous system directly. It wasn't a comment on the rescue team. It wasn't about the elevator. We both knew what she meant. Once those doors opened, the world would rush back in. The titles, the hierarchy, the HR policies, the merger from hell. It would all come crashing back, rebuilding the walls between us brick by brick. But in this suspended box, in this dark, overheated slice of nowhere, none of that existed. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she wasn't asking for permission to panic. She was asking for permission to want. She was acknowledging the 2 years of stolen glances, the lingering touches, the electricity that we had both pretended was just static. She was handing me the detonator and asking me to press the button. "Daisy," I breathed, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my own blood. "Don't," she said, pulling back just enough to look me in the eye again. Her voice was fierce now, stripped of the fear. "Don't call me that. Not right now. Right now, I'm not your boss. I'm just the woman who's been watching you watch me for 24 months." The air didn't just thicken, it solidified. It became a medium we were trapped in, amber hardening around 2 prehistoric insects. The professional world, the deadlines, the hierarchy, it all dissolved into the background radiation of the dark elevator shaft. There was only the hum of blood in my ears, and the woman standing in my personal space, dismantling the architecture of my life with a single sentence. She had been watching. The shark in the fishbowl hadn't been hunting prey. She had been circling a reflection of her own desire. The realization hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of my lungs. My hands, usually so disciplined, so careful to stay within the lines of corporate conduct, moved without my permission. I needed an anchor. I needed to know if this was a hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation or a tangible reality. My fingers found the lapel of her blazer. This was the fabric anchor, the texture of authority I had admired from 3 feet away for 24 months. It was cool, expensive Italian wool, rougher than it looked under the fluorescent boardroom lights. But beneath the structured tailoring, I felt the heat of her body radiating through the lining. It was a shocking contrast, the cold, hard shell of the CFO and the frantic, human warmth of Daisy underneath. I gripped the fabric, bunching the pristine material in my fist, grounding myself in the physical transgression of wrinkling her suit. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her breath hitching, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the tiny space. She lowered her head further, the movement agonizingly slow, until her face was buried in the curve of my neck. This was the warm breath anchor. It was a sensation so intimate it felt like a violation of physics. I felt the damp, uneven rhythm of her exhalations against my pulse point, hot and desperate. It was the ghost of a touch, a phantom pressure that sent shockwaves through my nervous system. Every breath she took against my skin stripped away another layer of my defense. My head fell back against the mahogany paneling, exposing my throat to her, a gesture of absolute surrender. The perfume anchor became the entire atmosphere. The scent of sandalwood and cold air was no longer a polite signature. It was an enveloping fog. It drowned out the smell of the mechanical grease, the stale recycled air, the metallic tang of the elevator shaft. It was heavy, intoxicating, tasting of spices and secrets. It filled my nose, my mouth, my lungs, until I wasn't breathing air anymore. I was breathing her. It was a sensory overload that short-circuited the logical part of my brain, the part that whispered about HR policies and career suicide. That voice was silent now, choked out by the overwhelming, dark reality of her scent. "Daisy," I whispered again, but this time it wasn't a question. It was a claim. She lifted her head. Her eyes were dark voids in the gloom, searching mine with a terrifying intensity. Her hand came up, trembling, and cupped my jaw. Her thumb traced the line of my bottom lip, rough and hesitant. The friction was electric. Then the hesitation broke. She kissed me. It wasn't like the movies. There was no orchestral swell, no graceful tilt. It was a collision. It was slow at first, tentative, a testing of the waters to see if the reality could match the fantasy. Her lips were soft, yielding, tasting of coffee and anxiety. But then the dam broke. The kiss turned desperate, hungry, a release of 2 years of repressed energy. It was a conversation we had been having in silence for months, finally spoken aloud. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, erasing the last millimeter of space between us. My hands slid from her lapels to her waist, pulling her flush against me, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of her. We were devouring each other, trying to make up for every missed opportunity, every polite nod, every cold email in a span of seconds. It was messy and hard and perfect. It was the feeling of falling without hitting the ground. For a moment, we were suspended in time, existing in a universe that consisted only of this steel box and the friction of our mouths. The fear of the crash was gone. The fear of the dark was gone. There was only the heat, the sandalwood, and the terrifying realization that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Then, the universe corrected itself. Above us, in the darkness of the shaft, a massive gear engaged with a metallic screech that sounded like a scream. The elevator car shuddered violently, lurching downward a few inches before catching on the emergency brakes with a bone-jarring slam. The sound tore through the intimacy like a gunshot. We broke apart, gasping, eyes wide, as the reality of the steel cage came rushing back in. The trance was broken. The machinery had woken up, and with it, the world. The machinery groaned back to life, with a sound that tore through the elevator car like a scream. The emergency brakes released with a shudder that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. Then, the worst thing possible happened. The overhead LEDs didn't just flicker. They surged back to life with a blinding, sterile whiteness. It was an assault. 1 second, we were wrapped in the forgiving, heated shadow of our own making. The next, we were exposed under the harsh, unforgiving glare of corporate illumination. I blinked, shielding my eyes, but the damage was done. The light stripped away the mystery, illuminating everything we had just tried to hide. It showed the flush on Daisy's neck, a map of where my mouth had been just seconds ago. It showed the disarray of her blouse and the terror in her eyes. Not fear of the elevator falling, but fear of what we had just done. The physical separation was immediate and brutal. It was like magnetic poles suddenly flipping. We sprang apart. Daisy retreated to the far corner near the control panel, her back hitting the wall with a hollow thud. I scrambled to the opposite side, putting the maximum possible square footage between us. The air in the car was still thick with the scent of sandalwood and sex, but now it felt illicit, dangerous. "Fix your hair," she snapped. Her voice was brittle. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at her reflection in the brass panel, frantically smoothing her skirt, buttoning her blazer, rebuilding the fortress of the CFO in real time. I turned to the mirrored wall. My reflection looked like a stranger. My eyes were wild, lips swollen and red. I looked like someone who had just been unraveled. I used my hands to smooth my hair, tucking loose strands behind my ears with trembling fingers. We were two actors backstage, frantically changing costumes before the curtain rose. The elevator lurched again, then began a smooth, steady descent. The hum of the motor was a mocking return to normalcy. I watched the digital display above the door. 33, 32, 31. The numbers weren't just counting floors. They were counting down the seconds we had left in this secret world. Each ding was a hammer blow, nailing the coffin of our intimacy shut. Daisy pulled a compact from her pocket, her hands shaking. She snapped it open, wiping a smudge from the corner of her mouth. My smudge, erasing the evidence with a ruthless efficiency that made my stomach turn. She took a deep breath, held it for 4 seconds, and exhaled. When she looked up, the mask was back. The vulnerability was gone, sealed away behind the icy facade of the executive. "When the doors open," she said, her voice steady now, "walk to your car. Don't stop. Don't look back." "Daisy," I started, the name feeling heavy in the bright light. "Ms. Thorne," she corrected, her eyes flashing a warning. "We are back on the clock. 10, 9, 8. The descent felt agonizingly slow, yet terrified me with its inevitability. I wanted the cable to snap. I wanted to stay in the box forever rather than face the lobby. But the machine didn't care about my panic. It continued its relentless return to the ground floor. 3, 2, L. The chime was cheerful. The doors slid open smoothly, revealing the expansive, marble-floored lobby. It was empty, save for the night security guard, an older man named Jerry, who was rushing toward the elevator bank with a look of genuine concern. "Miss Thorne, are you all right?" he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Maintenance said the brakes seized. We were about to call the fire department." Daisy stepped out. Her stride was perfect. Her chin was up. "We are fine, Jerry. Just a minor inconvenience. Please ensure the maintenance crew logs the fault code this time." I followed her out, my legs feeling like jelly. The cool air of the lobby hit me like a slap. It smelled of floor wax and lemon, sterile and clean. Jerry looked at us, searching for signs of trauma, oblivious to the fact that the real accident hadn't been mechanical. He didn't see the wreckage of our professional boundaries smoldering behind us. "Have a good night, Jerry," I mumbled, keeping my head down. I walked toward the parking garage exit, my heels clicking on the marble. The sound was lonely. Behind me, I heard Daisy's footsteps heading in the opposite direction toward the executive lot. The silence between our retreating forms wasn't empty. It was screaming with everything we couldn't say. The elevator doors hissed shut behind us, sealing the scene of the crime, leaving us stranded in the wreckage of the real world. Walking into the lobby the next morning felt like stepping onto a movie set after the cameras had stopped rolling. The building stood exactly as it had 24 hours ago, a towering monolith of glass and steel piercing the gray city sky. The security turnstiles beeped with the same rhythmic indifference. The marble floors gleamed with the same aggressive polish. But the world had tilted on its axis, and I seemed to be the only one struggling to keep my balance. I felt transparent, as if the secret I was carrying was glowing neon beneath my skin. I bypassed the elevator bank entirely, unable to face the sight of those brushed steel doors. I took the stairs to the second floor and caught a service elevator the rest of the way, hiding in the back behind a cart of mail. The office was buzzing with the manic energy of a Friday morning. Phones were ringing, keyboards were clacking, the coffee machine was hissing steam. It was the soundtrack of normalcy, and it grated on my nerves like sandpaper. I walked to my cubicle, keeping my head down, terrified that if I made eye contact with anyone, they would see the smudge of Daisy's lipstick that I was convinced was still branded on my soul, even if I had scrubbed it off my skin. The 10 a.m. debrief was mandatory. I walked into the boardroom, my legs feeling like they were filled with lead. The room was cold, the air conditioner blasting to counteract the body heat of 20 senior staff members. And there she was. Daisy stood at the head of the mahogany table, reviewing a slide deck on the projector screen. She was wearing a charcoal gray suit today, sharp enough to cut glass. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, immaculate twist. Her posture was rigid, commanding. She looked like a statue carved from ice and ambition. There was no trace of the woman who had trembled in the dark, no trace of the breath that had ghosted against my neck. She was the CFO again, terrifying and remote. I sank into a chair at the far end of the table, making myself as small as possible. Panic began to rise in my throat, tasting of bile. Had I imagined it? The stress of the merger, the lack of oxygen, the exhaustion. Had my brain fabricated a moment of intimacy to cope with the fear of the crash? The doubt was a physical pain. If it hadn't happened, I was losing my mind. If it had happened, and she was acting like this, I was about to lose my job. I stared at my hands, clenched in my lap, waiting for the axe to fall. The variance in Q3 is unacceptable, Daisy said. Her voice was clear, projecting to the back of the room without effort. It was the voice of authority. We need to drill down into the logistics spend. She turned to the room. Her gaze swept over the table, dismissing the VPs, the directors, the managers. Then it landed on me. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't a smile. It was a collision. For a fraction of a second, a unit of time too small to measure but long enough to stop my heart, her eyes locked onto mine. And in that micro moment, the boardroom vanished. I saw the flash of memory in her pupils. I saw the heat. I saw the acknowledgement that we were both liars playing a role. She held my gaze just a beat too long, a silent, terrifying confirmation. I remember. Then she blinked, and the wall slammed back down. She turned back to the screen, continuing her sentence without a stutter, but I saw her hand tighten on the laser pointer until her knuckles turned white. I needed air. I slipped out as soon as the meeting adjourned, ducking into the break room for water. It was empty except for 2 junior associates from marketing leaning against the counter, whispering. I heard the repair guy said the cables were actually frayed, one whispered, a thrill of drama in his voice. Can you imagine? Stuck in a box with thorn? I'd rather take the stairs, the other laughed, shaking his head. I bet she tried to fire the elevator for incompetence. The woman is a machine. She probably didn't even sweat. I stood there, gripping my paper cup, listening to them reduce her to a caricature. They didn't know. They didn't know about the sandalwood turning heavy in the heat. They didn't know how soft her mouth was when the command dissolved. A strange, fierce protectiveness surged in my chest. I wanted to tell them they were wrong. I wanted to tell them she was more human than all of them combined. But I stayed silent, drinking my water, hoarding the truth like a diamond in my pocket. I returned to my desk, the adrenaline crash leaving me shaky. I tried to focus on a spreadsheet, but the numbers swam before my eyes. Then, the notification sound cut through the noise of the office. A single, sharp ping. I looked at the bottom right of my screen. A new email from Thorn Daisy, CFO. Subject, 11:30 a.m. There was no body text, no please see me, no regarding the merger. Just a time. A summons. I looked at the clock. It was 11:25. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was the reckoning. The elevator doors were opening again, and this time there was no darkness to hide us. I stood up, smoothed my blazer, and began the long walk down the hall to the corner office. The walk to the corner office felt less like a commute and more like a march toward a sentencing hearing. The frosted glass of her door loomed at the end of the corridor, the bold black letters of her nameplate, Daisy Thorn, CFO, acting as a warning sign. My palms were damp. I wiped them surreptitiously on my skirt before raising my hand to knock. The sound was sharp, 3 distinct raps that seemed to echo too loudly in the hushed hallway. Come in. Her voice was muffled by the heavy wood, but the command was unmistakable. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The atmosphere in the office was a jarring shift from the bright, chaotic energy of the bullpen. The blinds were drawn tight, slicing the midday sun into thin, dusty ribbons of light that barely illuminated the room. The overhead fluorescents were off. The only light came from the soft glow of her desk lamp and the city struggling to get in through the slats. It felt like a bunker. It felt like the elevator. Daisy wasn't sitting behind the fortress of her mahogany desk. She was standing in front of it, leaning back against the wood, her arms crossed over her chest. The posture was defensive, a physical barricade she had erected between her heart and her job title. She watched me enter, her face unreadable in the shadows. "Close the door," she said. Her voice was low, lacking the projection she used in the boardroom. I pushed the door until it clicked shut. The sound of the latch engaging was heavy, sealing us in. The hum of the outer office vanished, replaced by the intimate silence of the room and the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. "I spent the morning drafting a risk assessment," she began, skipping the pleasantries. She didn't offer me a seat. We stood, facing each other, across 10 feet of plush carpet. I reviewed HR Policy 4.2 regarding interdepartmental relationships and power dynamics. I calculated the probability of reputational damage versus the operational efficiency of maintaining the status quo. She was speaking in spreadsheets. She was trying to box the chaos of the previous night into a neat, solvable equation. "And?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I felt like I was standing on a ledge. Daisy uncrossed her arms. She took a slow breath, and for a second, the CFO dissolved. She looked down at her shoes, the same heels that had clicked so confidently on the marble, and then back up at me. The vulnerability was back, sharper this time because it was happening in the daylight. "The logic dictates that we pretend the mechanical failure was the only thing that happened," she said quietly. "We delete the footage from our memories. We go back to the architecture of distance. It is the only safe play." "Can you do that?" I asked. "Can you delete it?" She stared at me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, charged with the memory of sandalwood and heat. "No," she admitted. The word was a surrender. "I looked at the variance report this morning, and all I could smell was your hair. I looked at the board members, and I hated them for being in the room when I just wanted to be back in that box with you." The air in the room shifted. The tension wasn't fear anymore. It was the magnetic pull of a shared secret. She pushed off the desk and took a step toward me. "So we need a new protocol," she said, her voice firming up, finding a new kind of authority. "Out there, beyond that door, nothing changes. I am the shark, you are the analyst. We do not linger in the hallway, we do not touch. We are strangers with a shared employer." "And in here?" I asked, daring to close the distance between us. She reached out. Her hand found mine, her fingers sliding against my palm, warm and solid. It wasn't a handshake. It was an anchor. She squeezed, hard, a physical promise that grounded me in the reality of her touch. "In here," she whispered, her thumb tracing the pulse at my wrist. "We explore the variables that don't fit in the spreadsheet." It was a terrifying agreement. We were building a glass house inside a war zone. But as I looked at her, standing in the sliver of light, I knew I would sign whatever contract she put in front of me. "Understood," I said, squeezing her hand back. "Good." She pulled away slowly, the loss of contact leaving my skin tingling. "Now, go back to your desk. Don't look back." I turned to the door, my hand on the cold brass knob. "Ms. Thorne?" I said, pausing. "Daisy," she corrected softly from the shadows. "When the door is closed, it's Daisy." I walked out of the office, but I didn't feel like I was escaping. The click of the door behind me wasn't a barrier anymore. It was the sound of a vault, locking away the most valuable thing I owned. The elevator breakdown hadn't been a disaster. It was the inciting incident of a story that was just beginning. If you've ever found clarity in the most confined places, subscribe to follow where this secret leads.